So last lecture, we were looking at the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And of course, we discussed how in the United States, following the first textile mill, which was established in New England by Samuel Slater in Rhode Island in 1790, we've discussed that the Industrial Revolution starts first in Great Britain, largely because Great Britain was a small place, relatively. It was a place with resources, iron ore, coal. It was a place that had these sort of Enlightenment institutions that embraced individual rights, representative government, and of course credit and banking institutions that made it possible for early corporations to develop. Great Britain also was cut off from the conflict fighting on during the Napoleonic Wars following the French Revolution. It was cut off from that conflict, and this allowed for the Industrial Revolution to take shape there. Once the Industrial Revolution developed in Great Britain, of course, many of the ideas of the Industrial Revolution were protected as secrets, business secrets, because, of course, these machines that made up the Industrial Revolution, power looms, the spinning jenny, these types of things, now allowed you to produce cloth at a massive level of productivity. And so any business that had their access to a textile manufacturing mill had a great advantage over any country that didn't. The textile mills were brought to the United States largely through industrial espionage. And of course, we see this with Samuel Slater's mill as he memorized all of the machines. He memorized the factory that he worked on in England, and he brought this over to the United States and created Samuel Slater's mill in Rhode Island, which of course was, particularly in the early years, worked by the factory girls, who were girls who left the farm to come and live and work long hours, 6 days a week in Samuel Slater's mill. Of course, Robert Fulton, who was an artist and an inventor in a number of ways, develops the steamboat, 1807, and the steamboat, Robert Fulton's Clermont, very much interconnected the United States, which at the time was basically the Mississippi River to the East Coast at the time. The country is interconnected by canals, and these canals are traversed by steamboats on the Mississippi River, on the Ohio River, on the Great Lakes, and canals connected those areas, those lakes, to other major ports like New York City. The railroad, of course, by the middle of the 1850s, really starts to become a dominant force interconnecting the continent. Now, the Industrial Revolution also has very, very massive effects for the human capacity for destructive warfare. And also, in this sense, for colonization and forcible imperialism and conquest, which we see, of course, unleash its power on the developing world during the 1800s at a rate and a force of conquest never before seen in the world. Much of the Industrial Revolution, in both warfare and in other areas, was driven by the innovations of Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney, an American, was responsible with a couple of really, really important innovations. One of those innovations is the cotton gin, actually. And the cotton gin was a machine. It was turned by a hand-turned crank. And what the cotton gin did is it basically, it was like a spool, a big metal spool with little spikes on it. And you would turn the crank and it would take the seeds out of the cotton fibers. This allowed for cotton to become a really mass-produced, widespread raw material for making clothing, for making fabric. Of course, the ramifications of that were that as a result of that, the American South, particularly deep South areas like South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and so forth, became increasingly focused on growing cotton and, of course, using African American slaves to grow that cotton. The American South becomes increasingly reliant on slave labor to grow cotton, which becomes a critical textile raw material resource for the Northeast, as well as for the international clothing industry in places like Great Britain and in Europe. Eli Whitney's cotton gin, as a result, was one of the critical factors that led to the Civil War, which of course was rooted inherently in the South's reliance on slavery. The cotton gin, too, as it created a slave society in the American South, was also greatly responsible for increasing the entrenchment of racist ideas in the United States and in the American South. Eli Whitney also developed interchangeable parts. And this is an element of the Industrial Revolution that is inherent to how industrial manufacturing is done. Interchangeable parts is the idea of mass producing a product made of more or less identical pieces so that any piece can be used interchangeably in any item. Okay? Everything of the Industrial Revolution in mass production manufacturing, like a car, for example, is made of interchangeable parts. If you need a new starter for your car, you get the starter that fits your car and you put it on your car. It works on any car that uses that type of part. If you need a new lock made, the locks are all made of interchangeable parts. You get it fixed with a universal part. So interchangeable parts made it possible really to mass produce products because every item did not have to be custom made for every product. Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts was actually done first for the U.S. Army, who requested a more affordable contract for the production of muskets. And Eli Whitney presented the Army with all of these muskets that were made of interchangeable parts, which could then be mass-produced, be purchased more easily by the U.S. Army, and could all be interchanged and reassembled with relative ease, allowing for weapons to be fixed more easily, allowing for weapons to be created on greater scale, and allowing for a cheaper arming of the U.S. Army. So it was a real revolution. It made really the Industrial Revolution possible. Of course, the Industrial Revolution in warfare, we ultimately see technologies associated with the Industrial Revolution making war, making the human capacity for destructive behavior far greater. In the 1800s, you will see further advancement in rifling technology. A rifle, muskets of the Revolutionary Age are smooth-bore weapons. When you fire a ball from a musket, it has less it is less tightly, if you will, tightly inserted in the barrel, if you will. And this means it comes out with lower velocity and is far less accurate. Rifles have a kind of round sort of rifling inside the barrel. And this means that when coupled with something like the mini ball, which was a bullet designed to go in a rifle, you have a weapon that now fires at much higher velocity over much longer distance and is far more accurate. The American Civil War remains the most destructive conflict in American history. Over 700,000 people died in that war. And it was largely because of the widespread application of rifles and the mini ball, which meant that when coupled with older era tactics, those weapons and those battles were far more destructive, allowing for there to be battles where casualties numbered in the tens of thousands in some cases. You have the development of cordite gunpowder, the development of repeating rifles, breech-loading repeating rifles, and eventually Hiram Maxim's development of the machine gun. And here you see a picture from the early 20th century of a machine gun mounted on board the deck of a merchant vessel. Machine guns in the late 1800s, become really the most destructive item of industrial warfare. Machine guns are used in imperial conquests across Africa, and we see British armies, for example, colonizing Africa, able to almost annihilate huge armies of African fighters with a small number of people because of their employment of one, two, or a handful of machine guns, which allowed them to spray bullets at a high rate and effectively exert massive casualty consequences on their opponent. And of course, the machine gun is the foremost reason that the First World War becomes such a destructive conflict. Both sides possessing this weapon and making infantry charges against enemy lines really almost futile. The First World War witnesses some 9 million dead as a result largely of the destructive force of the machine gun. And of course, with the machine gun, you will also see the advent of heavy artillery, explosive shells that can be fired over a long distance, eventually advanced aerial technology, bombing technology, and by the end of the Second World War, atomic and then later nuclear weapons technology, all of which is connected to developments in the Industrial Revolution and which have greatly increased the ability of humans to make war on a destructive level never thought possible before. Those are really the consequences of this. Massive social changes. Here you see immigrants coming aboard in the United States. We see population actually increase as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Why? The reason why population really increases, even though workers who are in industrial manufacturing jobs, they're unskilled workers, they work in more dangerous, difficult positions, their pay is worse, their hours are longer, their conditions are generally worse, and they have no benefits of unemployment, Social Security, health insurance, disability. None of that stuff exists for unskilled industrial workers in this period of time in the 1800s. However, over the longer term, the Industrial Revolution creates population growth. And the reason it creates population growth is because you see a higher productivity of farming, which results in people living longer. It improves people's nutrition, and death rates decline. More food, better diet means less susceptibility to illness. And likewise, during this period, it's important to note, industry exists in pockets, particularly around ports in certain urban areas. But overall, the fundamental social change here is going to be a significant increase in population. Even while you're really sowing the seeds for a significant level of environmental destruction, the reality is that people start to live longer. And a century later, that creates some of its own issues, as the Industrial Revolution has revolutionized farming, but it also results in a massive increase in global population. And we're talking about an increase from the turn of the 20th century to turn 1900 till about the 21st century. You're talking about a population growth of roughly from about 1 billion to roughly 7 billion as a result of the massive growth in productivity of farming, which is connected to the industrialization of farming. Industrial Revolution produces larger cities, populations grow, and we see, because of the technology, the increasing movement of people throughout the world, particularly people migrating from places like Europe, Asia, Africa, and other parts of the world. And many of those populations, of course, came to North America, which was a very large continental area. There was a great deal of opportunity seen in the way of land and jobs and opportunity. And so in many ways, for a period of time in the late 1800s, early 20th century, North America was sort of one of the go-to places for populations migrating throughout the world as global populations, particularly in places like Western Europe and Central Europe, began to increase. With the Industrial Revolution, we see a growth in urbanization. London becomes a city of over 1 million people. Paris, a city of 600,000. These were massively sized cities for this period of time. By 1850, half of Great Britain lived, half of Great Britain, that is spelled wrong, but half of Great Britain lived in cities, and the country had to become a food importer. And of course, it relied on its increasing imperialism and colonialism to become a food importer, to import food from the various parts of its empire that it had seized and taken as a result of imperialist and militaristic conquest. What is life like in these cities? Life in an early industrial era city is dirty. The air is polluted. There's often poor sewage systems. Many of these cities experience cholera outbreaks in the late 1800s as there is a lack of proper sanitation, and human waste gets into drinking water, causing deadly outbreaks of cholera. Many of the building structures lack proper building codes, so there are problems with fires in tenement houses. There are problems with airborne diseases like tuberculosis that become very commonplace in cities. And so cities oftentimes had a great deal of social and environmental problems. Air pollution itself was a very major problem in the late 1800s and the early 20th century industrial city. Just as it's a problem in industrial cities today, and just as today we understand photochemical smog and we think about global climate change as a result of fossil fuel production, fossil fuel use, in the same sense, on a smaller level within cities themselves, you witness low-level air pollution that could be very bad for the lungs of the inhabitants. In some places like London, because London's in a subduction zone, this became known as the London fog. And the London fog was this sort of dingy, foggy air that was largely due to the widespread coal burning to heat people's homes. In fact, the first melt in the Alpine glaciers, the mountain glaciers of the Swiss Alps and the French Alps, in the Bavarian Alps, those glaciers had their first cases of melt back in the latter 1800s, and it was caused because of the coal dust that went up, the soot that went into the air, and it was carried and then dropped out on top of those mountain glaciers. And the residue made those glaciers slightly darker and dirty, which then attracted greater heat and began a number of the melt of alpine glaciers. Of course, we know as a scientific fact that most likely in our lifetime, we will witness the disappearance of all mountain glaciers, which of course is inherently related to the environmental ramifications of growing human populations that rely on the production and use of fossil fuels.